Harlem did not fall overnight. It did not crumble in chaos or war. It fell quietly, systematically, under the hands of one man. Frank Lucas was not the loudest gangster. He was not the most violent. He was invisible. Yet, by the late 1960s, he controlled an empire that stretched through Harlem and beyond, dictating supply, loyalty, and order in a city that had been fractured by crime, poverty, and corruption. To understand his rise, one must first understand Harlem in the 1960s. The streets were dominated by the mafia, street gangs, and a police force struggling to maintain control. Violence was common and power shifted constantly. Traditional criminals relied on fear to maintain dominance. The police relied on force. Both systems were visible, reactive, and flawed. Frank Lucas relied on none of these. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Frank Lucas, born in 1930 in rural North Carolina, Lucas grew up in poverty. He learned early that survival was about observation, patience, and discipline. Violence was unpredictable. Intelligence could be applied systematically. When he moved to Harlem, he did not immediately pursue power. He watched, learned, and understood the existing networks, their strengths, their weaknesses, and their blind spots. He became an apprentice to Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, the respected Harlem kingpin. Bumpy ruled through relationships, not brute force. Reputation mattered more than fear. Loyalty mattered more than weapons. Lucas absorbed these lessons quietly, internalizing the idea that power is most effective when it is invisible. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, Harlem expected conflict. Rivals prepared for bloodshed. The mafia anticipated reclaiming control. Police anticipated disorder. Instead, Frank Lucas acted. He did not fight for territory. He did not challenge gangs publicly. He went around them. Lucas saw that true power was control over supply. At the time, the heroin trade in New York was dominated by the mafia, with layers of intermediaries inflating prices and reducing quality. Lucas identified inefficiency as vulnerability. He bypassed the entire system, sourcing heroin directly from Southeast Asia. He eliminated middlemen, controlled quality, and dictated distribution. This was not street-level maneuvering, it was strategic dominance. He branded the product Blue Magic. It was pure, consistent, and reliable. Dealers switched allegiance without threats. Customers followed. Violence decreased. Predictability replaced chaos. The streets of Harlem were now managed, not merely contested. Police still patrolled. Rival gangs still existed. But Lucas held the true leverage. He controlled supply, discipline, and human behavior, not through fear, but through efficiency and consistency. Harlem had fallen under one man's influence, not because he was feared, but because he was organized. And that was just the beginning. Frank Lucas did not rule Harlem like most criminals did. He did not rely on chaos, fear, or brute force. He built an organization, a system that could survive pressure, expand without attention, and maintain control quietly. At the center of that system was supply. By sourcing heroin directly from Southeast Asia, Lucas cut out the mafia middlemen who controlled the trade for decades. He controlled quality, quantity, and pricing. Dealers trusted the product. Customers preferred it. Loyalty followed naturally, not because of fear, but because the system worked. Lucas's empire was structured like a business. Each associate had a role and no one knew more than necessary. Couriers moved shipments. Distributors handled sales. Money flowed upward cleanly. Mistakes were addressed privately. Public violence was minimized. The system was invisible, efficient, and almost impervious to law enforcement. Police expected chaos, shootouts, informants, visible disputes. Lucas's operation produced none of these signals. Arrests happened, but they never reached the core. The organization absorbed disruptions and continued functioning. Lucas himself remained deliberately ordinary. He avoided flashy clothing, nightclubs, and public appearances. Power, he understood, works best when it blends into the background. The mafia noticed too late. They had relied on reputation, intimidation, and historical control. Lucas relied on efficiency. He did not confront them directly. He simply made them irrelevant. Harlem changed under his influence. Streets became quieter. Dealers followed predictable rules. Disputes were settled internally. Violence declined, not because the city became safer, but because the system Lucas built demanded it. Expansion came naturally. The same principles were applied to nearby cities, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and beyond. Each new market followed the same blueprint: direct supply, strict discipline, and minimal exposure. Lucas faced his greatest challenge: human risk. Every associate was a potential vulnerability. People could be arrested, betray him under pressure, or make mistakes. Lucas mitigated this through compartmentalization. The drivers didn't know the distributors. Distributors didn't know suppliers. Money handlers didn't know routes. The system could lose pieces without collapsing. Law enforcement began noticing patterns. They observed an unusually efficient, low-violence heroin trade. Arrests did not disrupt supply. Investigators saw fragments of the operation but could not trace them to the center. Lucas had accomplished something unprecedented. He had made crime predictable, and predictable systems are far more dangerous than unpredictable ones. Harlem was no longer chaotic. It was managed, and the manager remained invisible, silent, and untouchable, at least for now. Once Frank Lucas had established dominance in Harlem, he did not rest. Expansion was inevitable, but it had to be calculated. Rapid growth would attract attention, and attention could destroy even the most disciplined operation. Lucas extended his system into Philadelphia, New Jersey, and other East Coast cities. The blueprint was always the same: direct supply, consistent product, strict rules, and minimal exposure. Dealers didn't follow him out of fear. They followed him because the system worked. Blue Magic became a trusted brand. It was reliable. Its purity was predictable. Customers returned. Dealers prospered under Lucas's structure, and loyalty strengthened naturally. Expansion brought its own danger: human risk. Every new associate introduced vulnerability. People could be arrested, turned informant, or make mistakes. Lucas mitigated these risks through compartmentalization. The drivers didn't know the distributors. Distributors didn't know suppliers. Money handlers didn't know routes. Knowledge was controlled, limited, and protected. Law enforcement noticed unusual patterns. Drug distribution was highly organized. Arrests did not disrupt supply. Surveillance revealed fragments of operations, but investigators could not connect them to a single orchestrator. The streets were quiet but flowing with millions in heroin trade, efficient, predictable, and untraceable. Lucas remained invisible. He avoided the limelight. He did not flaunt wealth. He did not rely on intimidation. To the outside world, he appeared ordinary, but inside the system, he was untouchable. Even the mafia, sidelined for years, could not reclaim authority. Traditional power structures based on fear and reputation had no leverage over a disciplined, efficient, and silent system. Lucas had created a new paradigm: control through order, not chaos. Harlem and surrounding cities adjusted. Dealers, gangs, and even minor criminals became dependent on Lucas's system, whether they realized it or not. The streets were not peaceful, they were structured. The rules were invisible, but breaking them carried consequences: loss of access to product and profit. Yet Lucas' new expansion increased exposure. The more cities under his control, the more law enforcement could observe, analyze, and coordinate. Surveillance, wiretaps, and informants slowly began mapping the system. Lucas countered by rotating personnel, limiting communication, and enforcing strict operational discipline. Still, the risk was growing. No matter how brilliant, no system built entirely on human compliance can remain impervious. Loyalty, secrecy, and discipline are all tested under pressure. And pressure was coming. Federal authorities were no longer chasing street dealers, they were tracking networks. They were looking for the unseen orchestrator. And as Lucas expanded, he drew more eyes, more scrutiny, and more risk. The empire he had built, quiet, disciplined, and invisible, was about to face its first true test. Sustained federal pressure combined with the human vulnerabilities he could never fully control. Harlem remained under his influence, but now the balance between power and exposure was precarious. One misstep, one betrayal, or one observation could begin the unraveling. For years, Frank Lucas's operation had remained nearly invisible. Harlem was quiet. Dealers were disciplined. Violence was minimized. Law enforcement, accustomed to chaos, struggled to identify the source of the unusually efficient heroin trade. But efficiency has a way of attracting attention. By the mid-1970s, federal authorities realized they were not chasing ordinary street criminals. They were facing an organized, centralized network that defied conventional understanding. DEA and FBI agents began coordinating investigations across city lines. Wiretaps were installed. Surveillance teams monitored suspected locations. Patterns emerged. Consistent shipments, uniform product quality, and predictable distribution schedules. Lucas felt the pressure. He tightened his operation, rotated personnel, limited communication, and compartmentalized knowledge even further. The drivers didn't know the distributors. Distributors didn't know suppliers. Money handlers didn't know routes. The structure was resilient, but expansion had increased exposure. More people meant more potential leaks. The first cracks appeared with arrests. Low-level operatives faced long prison sentences, and some cooperated under pressure. Names, locations, and shipment details began surfacing, fragments that federal agents could piece together. Harlem sensed the shift too. Surveillance became visible, police presence increased, dealers became cautious. The calm order Lucas had maintained began to feel fragile. Though his system still functioned, it operated under tension. Even the mafia observed quietly. They had been displaced, sidelined by Lucas's efficiency. Now they watched as the empire that replaced them began facing pressure. Their lesson was clear. All human systems, no matter how disciplined, have a breaking point. Lucas understood the danger better than anyone. Law enforcement didn't need to storm his empire violently. They only needed time. They only needed patience. Human loyalty, under threat of decades-long imprisonment, could be compromised. The man who had controlled an entire city through order rather than fear, now faced unseen vulnerabilities within his own ranks. Harlem hadn't turned against him. His streets hadn't rebelled. But the system that had held them all in balance, the system that made him America's most disciplined dealer, was now under a microscope. Lucas remained calm. He understood the principle every strategist fears. No matter how perfect a system seems, human behavior under stress is unpredictable. One betrayal, one error, one overlooked signal could unravel everything. And as federal investigations intensified, the invisible empire that had controlled an entire city began to show signs of strain. The stage was set for collapse. The fall of Frank Lucas's empire did not arrive with gunfire or riots. It arrived quietly, through paperwork, warrants, and federal strategy. The very system that had made him untouchable, a disciplined, invisible network controlling heroin supply across cities, was now exposed to the relentless pressure of law enforcement. Key operatives were arrested first. Low-level dealers, distributors, and couriers faced decades-long sentences. Most knew only fragments of the operation, but under pressure, fragments became confessions. Shipment routes, payment schedules, and personnel were revealed. Every piece of information connected back to the architect himself. When Lucas was finally arrested, Harlem felt the impact immediately. The order he had imposed, the quiet discipline of the streets, the predictability of supply, the management of disputes, vanished almost overnight. Dealers scrambled for new sources. Rival gangs fought to reclaim territory. Violence surged. The calm Lucas had engineered had been fragile, and without him, chaos returned. In court, prosecutors described Lucas not just as a drug dealer, but as a strategist and organizer. He had built an operation rivaling the efficiency of a corporation. Every detail, from sourcing heroin in Southeast Asia to branding it as blue magic, demonstrated careful planning and foresight. The discipline that had protected him now served as evidence against him. Lucas received a lengthy federal sentence, and many of his associates were convicted as well. The empire he had spent years constructing, a network invisible, efficient, and nearly untouchable, crumbled under the weight of investigation. Yet even in defeat, Lucas demonstrated strategy. He cooperated selectively, providing information on corrupt officials and rival operations, reducing his sentence and protecting himself from the full weight of the law. The man who had once ruled Harlem silently now used words as leverage. Harlem itself changed. Where once streets had been organized, disciplined, and predictable, now disorder returned. Violence increased, and the absence of Lucas's system created opportunities for gangs and opportunistic dealers. Law enforcement could patrol, arrest, and prosecute, but the structured order he had imposed was gone forever. Even the mafia, sidelined for years, could not reclaim the control they had lost. The markets Lucas had reorganized remained forever altered. He had proven something unprecedented. One man, operating intelligently and invisibly, could control an entire city without open displays of power. Yet human systems, no matter how well constructed, are fragile. Lucas's fall illustrated the limits of even the most disciplined operations. Loyalty, compartmentalization, and efficiency can be undone by time, pressure, and human vulnerability. Harlem did not revolt against him. It did not rise in protest. It simply adjusted. And in that adjustment, the empire that had quietly dominated an entire city disappeared, almost as quietly as it had arrived.